I was driving back from a work trip, way out in the middle of nowhere, when I noticed I was low on gas. The gauge blinked red, so I started looking for a place to refuel. I hadn't seen another car or person for miles, and there was no signal, which added to the uneasy feeling creeping over me. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the deserted road, when I finally spotted a gas station up ahead. It looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s, and the only light came from a single, flickering bulb above the pumps. The place was dead silent, surrounded by dense trees on all sides. I pulled up to one of the pumps, got out, and fumbled for my wallet, glancing around. There was a chill in the air, and the eerie quiet felt suffocating. Then I noticed something odd. The pump didn't have any prices displayed. It wasn't just broken. There were no numbers on it at all, as if it had been stripped down. And then I saw the attendant. He was standing inside the small, glass-walled office, staring straight at me. His clothes were faded, almost blending with the dim light. I couldn't make out his face, just his silhouette. Something about his stance was off, like he'd been waiting for me specifically. He didn't move or acknowledge me, just watched. I waved awkwardly, hoping he'd come out, but he stayed still, rooted to that spot behind the counter. I looked down at the pump and realized it didn't have a card reader. There was no way to pay outside, so I'd have to go in. But as soon as I put my hand on the door, an overwhelming dread hit me. I hesitated, debating if I should just drive to the next town, but my tank was practically empty. The second I stepped inside, a rancid smell hit me, like old meat mixed with gasoline. The place was silent except for the faint hum of an old fridge in the corner. The attendant was still there, but now I could see his face, or rather what looked like his face. His skin was unnaturally tight, stretched too far over his skull, and his eyes, they were wrong. They didn't seem to move, just stared right through me. "Gas?" he asked in a low, strained voice, his mouth barely moving. Yeah, pump one," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded slowly, still staring at me, and then turned, his movements jerky and mechanical. As he did, I noticed something on the counter. An old, rusted key, labeled basement. Beside it was a photograph, half-burned, showing a young girl with long dark hair standing in front of the gas station. Her face was scratched out, as though someone had violently erased it from the photo. The attendant went to a back room without another word, and I took the chance to look around. On the wall was a dusty corkboard with several missing person flyers, all young people, and each flyer looked like it had been there for years. I scanned the names and dates, 2004, 2011, 2019. All of them had been last seen near this stretch of road. I felt a rush of cold sweat as the gravity of my situation hit me. Just as I turned to bolt, the attendant reappeared, holding a canister of gas. "The pump don't work," he said flatly. "Take this instead." He pushed the canister toward me and nodded toward my car. I forced a nod and grabbed the canister, but as I did, he leaned in close, too close. I could smell the rot on his breath as he whispered, "You shouldn't be here after dark." Shaken, I backed out of the station and quickly poured the gas into my tank, my hands trembling. As I finished, I looked back at the station. The attendant was standing outside now, watching me, only there were more of them. Shadows had gathered in the office, all staring out through the glass with those same hollow eyes, faces stretched in eerie smiles that didn't reach their eyes. I jumped into my car, started the engine, and peeled out of there, watching in my rearview as the figures watched, unmoving, until they were swallowed by the darkness. The road stretched ahead, empty and dark, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My hands gripped the wheel tightly as my eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those hollow-eyed figures standing in the middle of the road, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the faint red glow of my taillights bouncing off the trees as I sped away. I tried to calm my breathing, telling myself that I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks, but that didn't explain what I'd seen. And that voice, raspy and hollow, "You shouldn't be here after dark," it echoed in my mind, cold and sinister. A few miles down the road, my headlights caught a glimpse of something off to the side, a rusty old sign half buried in overgrown weeds. It read, "Silent Creek Gas Station," but something was scratched out below it. I slowed down, trying to read the letters beneath, but a loud thud from the back of the car made me swerve and nearly crash into a ditch. My heart was hammering as I pulled the car over. I stayed frozen in the driver's seat, hands shaking, staring into the darkness around me. I didn't want to get out, didn't want to check what had made that noise, but my curiosity got the better of me, and I grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment before cautiously stepping out. As I moved to the back of the car, I noticed the trunk was slightly ajar. I knew I hadn't opened it. Swallowing hard, I reached out and lifted it the rest of the way. Inside, lying on the floor of my trunk, was the photograph from the gas station counter. The same burned and scratched picture of the young girl with long dark hair, her face violently erased. It was impossible. I'd left that back at the station. But there it was, in my trunk, and on the back, someone had scrawled in jagged handwriting, "Help me." A chill ran down my spine, and I slammed the trunk shut, glancing around the empty, silent road. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I needed to get out of there. I climbed back into the car, locking the doors, and sped off, my heart racing faster with each mile. For a moment, the road was calm. The hum of the engine was almost comforting, lulling me into a false sense of security. But then, I noticed something in the rearview mirror, a set of headlights. I squinted, trying to make out the vehicle, but the headlights were too bright, blinding me. The car was getting closer, inching up behind me until it was practically tailgating me. I pressed harder on the gas, trying to put some distance between us, but the other car matched my speed, staying right behind. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, my car began to sputter, the engine struggling as if something were clogging it. Panic surged as the car slowed down, despite my desperate attempts to keep it going. Finally, the engine gave out altogether, and I rolled to a stop on the shoulder of the dark, deserted road. I watched in horror as the car behind me pulled over too, stopping just a few feet away. His headlights were blinding, and I couldn't see the driver. I sat there, paralyzed, staring into the glare, waiting for whoever it was to get out. But no one did. The car just sat there, headlights burning into mine. It felt like hours passed, though it was likely only minutes. My mind raced with thoughts of those missing person flyers, those scratched out faces. What if this was someone from the gas station? Or worse, one of those figures I'd seen through the glass? Then, suddenly, the headlights went out, plunging everything into darkness. I was blind, unable to see a thing outside. My hands scrambled for my flashlight, fumbling as I clicked it on, shining it toward the other car. But the beam only reached the empty road where the car had been parked. The car was gone. My heart pounded as I swung the flashlight around, scanning the shadows. I could have sworn I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, getting closer. The footsteps grew louder, crunching over the gravel on the side of the road, deliberate and unhurried, like whoever was out there wanted me to know they were coming. I sat frozen in the driver's seat, clutching the flashlight in one hand, my phone in the other, though I knew there was no signal out here. My only thought was to stay absolutely still, hoping that whatever or whoever was out there would somehow pass me by. Then came a soft tapping on the window, just inches from my face. My body tensed, but I forced myself to turn, slowly, dreading what I'd see. The flashlight beam wavered as I held it up, casting a faint glow on the window. But there was nothing there, just darkness and my own reflection staring back at me, wide-eyed and terrified. I turned the flashlight toward the road, aiming it in the direction I'd heard the footsteps, but all I could see were shadows stretching across the empty pavement. I leaned forward, peering into the darkness, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing just outside the beam of light. A man, his face hidden beneath the brim of a worn-out hat, his clothes hanging off him in tattered layers. He stood still, watching me, unmoving. "Do you need help?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper, the words catching in my throat. The man didn't respond. He just kept staring, his face obscured by shadow, but I could feel his eyes on me, cold and unblinking. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering something, and took a single step forward. Panic surged through me. I flicked the locks, making sure every door was secure, but the man didn't seem fazed. He took another step, his movements slow and deliberate, his gaze never leaving mine. I was trapped, helpless, and every fiber of my being screamed at me to run. But I was stuck, paralyzed by the eerie calm that radiated from him. Then he stopped, his figure blurring at the edges as if he were dissolving into the darkness itself. He raised one hand, palm out, and pressed it against the glass. His skin was pale and mottled, his fingernails broken and blackened, leaving smears on the window as he dragged his hand down, leaving streaks of something dark and sticky. I could barely breathe, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might shatter my ribs. And then, just as suddenly as he'd appeared, he was gone, fading into the shadows, leaving only the smeared handprint on the window. I sat there, shaking until my survival instincts finally kicked in. I had to get out of here, to find help, to do something. I twisted the key in the ignition, and to my relief, the engine sputtered back to life. I slammed my foot on the gas, speeding down the dark road, glancing in the mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see that man standing in the road behind me. But the road stayed empty, the night stretching endlessly ahead. I was miles away from that gas station, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, lurking just out of sight. The smeared handprint on my window was still there, a grim reminder of whatever I'd seen or thought I'd seen. Finally, just as my nerves were about to shatter, I saw the faint glow of lights ahead. A diner, open late, the parking lot filled with a few trucks and cars. I practically skidded to a stop outside, stumbled out of the car, and ran inside, the bell over the door jingling as I burst in. The place was quiet, only a handful of people sitting at booths, most of them truckers nursing cups of coffee. The waitress looked up, surprised, as I approached her, probably looking like I'd seen a ghost. "Are you okay, Han?" she asked, her voice kind but wary. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I pointed back to my car, gesturing wildly. There was a man. He followed me. The waitress exchanged a glance with a man at the counter, a grizzled trucker who was watching me with a frown. "Slow down, honey," she said gently, guiding me to a booth. "Start from the beginning." I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, and began to recount everything. The gas station, the attendant, the car that had followed me. I reached the part about the man at the window, the smeared handprint, and as I spoke, the waitress's face grew pale, her expression darkening. When I finished, she nodded slowly, then looked toward the trucker, who gave her a grim nod in return. "That gas station," she said quietly. "It's been abandoned for years. No one's worked there since the late 70s. Not since." She trailed off, her gaze drifting to the window as if looking for something outside. "Not since what?" I asked, my voice trembling. The waitress sighed, shaking her head. "People used to disappear on that stretch of road. Travelers, mostly folks just passing through. They'd stop for gas and then vanish. They found their cars sometimes, but never their bodies. After a while, no one would go near that place. Folks say it's cursed, haunted by the people who disappeared." She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They say sometimes on dark nights those people come back. But they're not the same, and they don't like it when strangers stop by." A chill ran down my spine as her words sank in. I glanced back toward my car, dread pooling in my stomach as I realized the handprint was still there, dark and smudged on the glass. But when I looked closer, I saw something else. A single word scrawled in shaky, uneven letters across the foggy glass. "Run." I bolted upright. The word "run" burned into my mind like a brand. Every instinct I had screamed to get out of there, but my legs felt like lead. I was too terrified to look back at my car again. I could feel everyone's eyes on me. The truckers, the waitress, but they didn't say a word. They just watched me with that same wary, haunted look, as if they knew exactly what was out there and had no intention of getting involved. "Is there a phone here I can use?" I finally managed, my voice barely more than a whisper. The waitress shook her head slowly. "Honey, no one's had a signal out here for years," she replied, almost apologetically. "Best we can do is get you a ride with one of the truckers in the morning." Couldn't believe it. I felt trapped. I wanted to scream, but I just nodded, trying to keep my breathing steady. There was no way I could make it through the night here, not with whatever was out there. I glanced around, looking for an escape, but the diner was nothing more than a glass-walled cage in the middle of nowhere. Then I felt it. A chill crept down my spine, like a cold hand running up my back. The fluorescent lights in the diner flickered, and a strange, oppressive silence fell over the place. The truckers exchanged uneasy glances, and one of them stood, muttering under his breath about getting out of Dodge, but the others just stared down at their coffee mugs, as if they'd already accepted whatever fate awaited them. Then the lights flickered again, and I saw them. Outside, just beyond the faint glow of the diner's lights, figures started to appear, one by one, barely visible in the darkness. They stood in the shadows, scattered along the edge of the parking lot, motionless, like mannequins posed under the night sky. I squinted, trying to make out their faces, but the more I looked, the less human they appeared. Some were tall, impossibly thin, their limbs bending at unnatural angles. Others were shorter, almost childlike, but with hunched backs and elongated shadows. The waitress's hand gripped my shoulder, her fingers ice cold. "Whatever you do, don't look at them directly," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They don't like being seen." My pulse hammered in my throat, but I couldn't help myself. I'd already looked, and now I couldn't look away. There was something horrifyingly mesmerizing about them, a twisted allure that held me captive. Slowly, one of the figures stepped forward, into the edge of the light. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized the tattered, familiar clothes. It was the gas station attendant. But his face, it was wrong. His skin was stretched tight, his eyes hollow and vacant, and his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin that looked painted on. He lifted his hand, the same one he'd pressed against my car window, and gave a slow, deliberate wave. A wave that beckoned me. I stumbled back, bumping into the counter, my legs weak and trembling. "No," I whispered, half to myself. "No, this can't be real." The waitress tightened her grip on my shoulder. "They're here for you," she murmured, her voice a thin thread of terror. "They can smell it on you, that fear, that hesitation. Once they mark you, they don't let go." The trucker who'd been muttering earlier finally snapped. He grabbed his coat and ran for the door, ignoring the waitress's frantic warnings. As soon as he stepped outside, the figures turned to him, their heads snapping in unison. The trucker froze, paralyzed, before his face twisted in a silent scream. In an instant, the figures swarmed him, their bodies distorting and shifting as they closed in around him. He vanished within their shadowy forms, his screams muffled by the inky darkness, until there was nothing left but silence. The figures turned back, their heads shifting toward the diner, their hollow eyes fixed on me once more. I felt my vision blur, darkness creeping in around the edges. This was it. This was the end. Then, I remembered the word on my car window. "Run." I broke free from the waitress's grip and darted toward the back door of the diner. I didn't care where it led, as long as it was away from those things. The door flew open, and I stumbled into the night, the cold air stinging my skin as I sprinted blindly down a gravel path behind the diner. Behind me, I could hear them, footsteps, impossibly fast, growing louder with every second. I ran harder, my lungs burning, my legs aching, but they were gaining on me, their shadows stretching along the ground, closing in. Then, just ahead, I spotted an old, run-down cabin, hidden beneath a cluster of trees. I threw myself toward it, practically falling through the door, and slammed it shut behind me. The interior was pitch black, the air thick with dust and rot, but I didn't care. I collapsed against the door, gasping for breath, praying that somehow this flimsy shelter would keep them out. But the silence that followed was worse than any noise. I heard a faint scratching outside the door, slow and deliberate, like fingernails dragging across the wood. It moved around the cabin, circling, searching. I closed my eyes, clamping my hand over my mouth to stifle my breathing, every nerve in my body screaming for me to stay still. Then came the whisper, soft and chilling, right outside the door. "Run." A voice, distorted and hollow, mimicking my own. I froze, trapped in the passenger seat, my mind racing with a single, horrifying thought. Asterisk, I didn't escape. I just ran right back to them. Asterisk, my eyes darted to the door handle, my fingers itching to grab it and throw myself from the car. But something kept me rooted in place. like invisible hands pressing down on my shoulders, holding me there. The driver's hollow gaze stayed fixed on the road, but his mouth, twisted in that sickening grin, kept whispering, "Run, run," softly under his breath, almost like a chant, the word filling the silence in the car until it felt like it was seeping into my bones. I could feel my own heartbeat, erratic and pounding, as I fought the urge to scream. The headlights stretched ahead, illuminating the deserted road winding through the trees, but something was wrong. No matter how far we drove, the scenery stayed the same. Endless, dark woods, twisted trees that seemed to close in on us. It felt like the road was leading nowhere, like we were trapped in some looping nightmare. And then I saw them. At first, it was just a shadow moving in the distance, flitting between the trees. But as we drove, more figures appeared, keeping pace with the car, slipping in and out of the darkness. Their hollow faces turned toward us, their twisted smiles gleaming in the dim light, their arms reaching out, clawing at the air as they moved alongside the car. The driver's chant grew louder, his voice deepening, distorting, becoming almost a growl. "Run, run, run." I reached for the door handle, ready to fling myself out into the darkness. But the driver's hand shot out, gripping my wrist with an iron force. His skin was ice cold, his fingers unnaturally long and bony, and his eyes finally shifted to meet mine. "Leaving so soon?" he whispered, his voice dripping with malice, that grin stretching wider, distorting his face until it barely looked human. I yanked my arm free, slamming my shoulder against the door, desperate to break free. "Let me out," I shouted, my voice barely above a whimper. "Please, just let me go." The driver laughed, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. "Go," he echoed, his voice mocking. "You can run all you want, but you're ours now." In a panic, I slammed my fist against the window, hoping to shatter it, but it didn't even crack. I was trapped, the walls of the car closing in around me, the figures outside moving faster, their faces pressing against the glass, their eyes wide and empty, their whispers joining in with the driver's chant. Suddenly, the headlights flickered, casting strange shadows that twisted and elongated, distorting the inside of the car until it felt like I was sitting in some warped, endless tunnel. The driver's face began to change, shifting and melting, his skin pulling back to reveal hollow eye sockets and a skeletal grin. In a final, desperate act, I grabbed the steering wheel, jerking it hard to the right, hoping to send the car off the road. The car veered sharply, spinning out of control, the trees blurring into dark shapes as we careened off the road. The driver didn't react. He just laughed, that horrible, echoing sound filling the car as we crashed through the underbrush. And then, impact. Everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the forest floor, the car nowhere in sight. My head throbbed, my body ached, and I could feel cold, damp earth beneath me. The air was thick, heavy with an unnatural silence, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I struggled to sit up, my vision swimming as I took in my surroundings. The woods were dense, shrouded in fog, the trees twisted and gnarled, reaching out like skeletal hands. I was alone, or so I thought. In the distance, I heard it, the whispering, faint at first but growing louder, closer. The same voices, chanting that single, horrifying word. "Run." My blood ran cold as I realized they were all around me, their twisted forms emerging from the mist, their empty eyes fixed on me, their smiles wide and hungry. I scrambled to my feet, stumbling backward, every nerve screaming at me to move, to get as far away from them as possible. I turned and ran, my legs weak and trembling, the ground uneven and treacherous. The whispering followed me, the shadows slipping through the trees, closing in from every side. No matter how fast I ran, they were always just behind me, their voices blending together in a sickening harmony, calling my name, urging me to stop, to give in. The fog thickened, swallowing up the trees until I could barely see a foot in front of me. I tripped, falling to my knees, the taste of blood in my mouth as I scrambled back up. I could feel them closing in, their cold breath on my neck, their twisted hands reaching out, brushing against my skin. And then, ahead of me, I saw a light, a faint, flickering glow cutting through the fog. Desperation surged through me, and I sprinted toward it, my lungs burning, my heart pounding. The light grew brighter as I drew closer, until finally, I burst into a clearing and found myself standing in front of the gas station. It was exactly as I'd left it. The old pumps, the broken sign, the flickering light casting long shadows across the empty lot. But something was different. The windows of the station were dark, the glass smeared with handprints. Hundreds of them, overlapping, some streaked with something dark and sticky, others trailing off into the blackness inside. I backed away, my heart racing as the shadows began to close in around me. I could feel their eyes on me, could hear their voices, all chanting that single endless word, driving me to the edge of madness. Then I heard a new voice, soft, almost a whisper, but familiar. "Run." I turned, and there, standing by the edge of the clearing, was the girl from the photograph. She was watching me, her eyes wide and filled with fear, her face scratched and bruised, her clothes torn and bloodied. She lifted one hand, pointing back toward the road, and mouthed the words, her voice barely a breath. "Run." Without a second thought, I turned and ran, my legs carrying me forward, my heart pounding as I stumbled back onto the road. I didn't look back, didn't dare to stop, not until I saw the faint glow of sunrise breaking through the trees. When I finally reached my car, parked haphazardly on the shoulder where I'd left it, I collapsed into the driver's seat, gasping for breath. I twisted the key in the ignition, my hands shaking, and to my relief, the engine roared to life. As I drove away, I dared to glance in the rearview mirror one last time. In the distance, just barely visible through the morning fog, I could see the gas station, fading into the shadows. And standing outside, watching me go, were the figures, their hollow eyes following me, their twisted smiles stretched wide, their hands raised in a final mocking wave. The last thing I heard, drifting through the air, was a single word, echoing in the silence. "Run." The days that followed felt like a fever dream. I drove for hours that morning, not stopping until I reached the first real sign of civilization, a small town with a crowded diner. I stumbled inside, barely able to hold myself together, my clothes torn, dirt streaking my face. People stared as I ordered coffee, but I didn't care. I needed to feel grounded, to shake the sense of unreality clinging to me like a shadow. For a while, the normal sounds of life around me, the clinking of dishes, the chatter of strangers, helped me feel sane again. But that reprieve was short-lived. A few nights later, just as I was drifting off to sleep, my phone buzzed. It was strange, because I hadn't given my number to anyone in that town, and I hadn't been in contact with anyone since the night I'd left. Dreading what I might find, I picked up the phone and looked at the screen. There was a single message. It read, "Run." My pulse quickened as I stared at the message, every horrible memory from that night at the gas station flooding back. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a glitch, or maybe someone had sent it by accident. But as I sat there, heart pounding, my phone buzzed again. Another message, this time with a picture attached. With trembling hands, I opened the photo, my breath catching in my throat as I saw the image. It was a shot of the gas station at night, the same eerie glow illuminating the pumps, the flickering light casting shadows that seemed to move, to shift, as if something, someone was waiting just out of view. In the background, half hidden in shadow, was the silhouette of the girl from the photograph, standing by the edge of the lot. Her head was bowed, her long, dark hair hiding her face, her arm raised as though she were pointing toward something, toward me. I nearly dropped the phone. My stomach twisted as I saw a reflection of myself in the glass. My own face, pale and haunted, framed by the same gas station in the background. It was impossible. I hadn't been back there. But there I was, unmistakably, staring out from behind the girl, my expression hollow and terrified. I slammed my phone down, breathing heavily, willing myself to calm down. I tried to tell myself that it was a trick, a prank, a leftover nightmare that had somehow seeped into my reality. But then another message appeared on my screen. This one was a video. I didn't want to open it. I didn't even want to touch the phone. But something compelled me to press play, my fingers moving as if under someone else's control. The screen flickered to life, showing a grainy, night vision view of a road I recognized as the one leading back to the gas station. The camera moved slowly, the view shifting left and right, as though it were searching for something. It stopped on a familiar sight. My car, parked haphazardly on the shoulder, exactly where I'd left it that night. But this time, the headlights were off, the doors wide open, as if it had been abandoned for years. The camera panned closer, and that's when I saw it. Standing beside the car, looking right into the lens, was me. Or something that looked like me. My doppelganger's face was drawn and pale, eyes hollow and empty. That same twisted grin stretched across my lips. My reflection in the video lifted a hand, pointing straight at the camera, pointing straight at me. And then, in a voice that echoed from the depths of the nightmare I'd escaped, it spoke. "Run." I threw my phone across the room, watching as it shattered against the wall. My heart was racing, my skin cold with fear, but I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. I sat there, staring at the broken pieces of glass and plastic scattered across the floor, the word echoing in my mind. The following days were a blur of sleepless nights and paranoia. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces. The girl, the driver, my own twisted reflection. I could hear their whispers in the silence, faint but unmistakable, calling my name, urging me to return, to run. I didn't want to believe it, didn't want to acknowledge that somehow they had followed me. But the signs were everywhere. Shadows that lingered too long, flickers in mirrors, the faint, nauseating smell of gasoline that seemed to cling to my clothes, my skin. It was as if the gas station's curse had marked me, tethered me to that place, no matter how far I tried to run. One night, when the whispers became too much to bear, I packed a bag and got into my car, not caring where I went as long as it was far away from here. I drove through the night, letting the road take me wherever it wanted, hoping against hope that I could escape. But as dawn broke, the headlights illuminating the fog-covered road, I saw it. Up ahead, the outline of an old, familiar sign half hidden by overgrown weeds. Silent Creek Gas Station. My hands went numb as I stared at the sign, dread pooling in my stomach. I looked down at the fuel gauge, realizing that once again, I was almost out of gas. And then, through the haze of morning light, I saw them. Figures standing in the lot, motionless, their hollow eyes watching, waiting. Among them was the girl, her hand raised, pointing right at me, her empty gaze locking onto mine. There was no mistaking the message in her eyes. Run. Only this time I knew. No matter how far I went, no matter how fast I ran, there was only one destination. I stared at the figures in the lot, frozen, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The road stretched endlessly behind me, but somehow, I knew there was no going back. I was caught in their trap, bound to this cursed stretch of asphalt and shadow. No matter how far I'd driven, no matter how much I tried to escape, I had always been headed back here, back to Silent Creek Gas Station. The figures stood motionless, shadows against the gray dawn. I could make out their faces now, twisted and wrong, eyes hollow and lips stretched into those sickening, unnatural grins. They weren't smiling with any warmth or kindness. They were grinning in triumph, like predators who had finally cornered their prey. And then, as if on cue, they began to move. Slowly, almost lazily, they started gliding forward, their feet barely touching the ground, closing the distance between us with each step. I swallowed hard, my mind racing, trapped between the urge to flee and the chilling knowledge that there was nowhere left to go. My gaze drifted to the gas gauge. The needle was below empty, barely hovering above the line, and I knew that if I tried to outrun them, I'd be stranded in minutes. In a moment of sheer desperation, I reached for my phone, forgetting for a second that I'd shattered it days ago. My fingers brushed against broken glass, a sharp reminder of just how hopeless my situation was. I was on my own. The first figure reached the edge of the lot, just feet from my car. It was the gas station attendant, his face sunken and gaunt, his eyes empty and lifeless. He raised a hand, palm out, and pointed at me, that eerie grin stretching wider, his mouth opening just enough for a raspy whisper to escape. "Come home," he croaked, his voice scraping the air like nails on a chalkboard. I shivered, the words chilling me to the bone. There was no escape, no road out. Somehow, they had always intended to bring me back here, to this cursed place. And as I stared at the gas station's crumbling facade, I understood Silent Creek was more than just a stop on the map. It was a trap, a place that didn't let go, that kept drawing people back, marking them, possessing them until they became part of it. My only choice was to confront it, to see this nightmare through. With a deep, shaky breath, I opened the car door, stepping out onto the gravel. The air was thick, suffocating, smelling of gasoline and decay. The figures surrounded me, their empty eyes watching, their twisted smiles gleaming in the dim light. I felt like an animal caught in a snare, trapped and helpless, but something in me refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing my fear. I took a step forward, my eyes locked on the gas station door, willing myself not to look at the grinning faces around me. My feet crunched against the gravel as I moved toward the station, the figures parting like a dark sea, their whispers growing louder, more insistent, filling my ears with that single maddening word. "Run, run, run." Ignoring them, I reached the door and pushed it open. Inside, the gas station was exactly as I'd left it that night, frozen in time, like some twisted snapshot of the past. Dust hung heavy in the air, and the single, flickering light cast long, eerie shadows across the cracked tiles. The counter was empty, the shelves bare, but I could feel a presence all around me, something ancient and malevolent watching from every corner. In the middle of the floor lay the photograph, the one of the girl with the scratched-out face. Trembling, I picked it up, the image warped and faded, but as my fingers touched the edges, a wave of memories flooded my mind. Memories that weren't mine. Images of people trapped, clawing at the walls, screaming for help as the shadows closed in, their faces twisted in fear, their voices pleading for escape. I dropped the photograph, stepping back, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I realized the truth. Silent Creek wasn't just a place, it was a prison. A prison for every lost soul that had ever stopped here, every person who had dared to step inside. And now I was part of it, bound to this cursed ground just like the others. Suddenly, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, coming face to face with the girl from the photo. Her face was clear now, her eyes wide and filled with sorrow, her mouth trembling as she reached out, fingers cold and ghostly against my skin. "They won't let you leave," she whispered, her voice barely audible, like a breeze rustling through leaves. "But if you go deeper, if you confront them, maybe you can break free." I didn't understand, but I nodded, sensing that she was offering my only chance. She pointed toward the back of the gas station, toward a door I hadn't noticed before, its frame dark and foreboding, as if it led into the very heart of the darkness that gripped this place. With one last look at her, I stepped toward the door, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to flee. But there was no turning back now. I had come too far, and I knew that whatever lay beyond that door was the only way to end this. I gripped the handle, pushing it open, and stepped into the darkness. The air inside was thick and cold, pressing down on me as I descended a narrow staircase, my footsteps echoing against the stone walls. The whispers grew louder, filling the space around me, their voices mingling in a chaotic, maddening symphony that tugged at my mind, pulling me deeper into the abyss. Finally, I reached the bottom, stepping into a large, cavernous room lit by a dim, pulsing glow that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Shadows danced across the floor, coalescing into shapes, faces, twisted and hollow, eyes empty and mouths stretched wide in silent screams. And in the center of the room stood a figure, its form shifting and flickering, its face a dark, hollow void. It was neither man nor woman, neither alive nor dead. It was the embodiment of every lost soul, every trapped spirit, every ounce of fear and despair that Silent Creek had claimed over the years. I felt its gaze on me, its presence pressing down like a weight on my chest, threatening to crush me. But I refused to look away. I had come this far, and I would see this through. "Why?" I whispered, my voice echoing in the vast chamber. "Why do you keep us here?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand, pointing toward me, its finger extending, stretching, until it was inches from my face. I felt a surge of cold, a chill that seeped into my bones, and in that moment, I understood. Silent Creek fed on fear. It thrived on the despair of those it trapped, the terror of those who tried to escape. It was a living nightmare, a parasite that preyed on the lost and the vulnerable, binding them to itself, consuming them piece by piece until there was nothing left but hollow shells, grinning in eternal, mindless horror. But I wasn't lost. Not yet. With a surge of defiance, I stepped back, breaking free from its grasp, my voice steady as I faced the entity. "You can't have me," I said, my words echoing with a strength I didn't know I had. I'm leaving. I'm not yours. The shadows writhed, the whispers rising to a fevered pitch, but I held my ground, my gaze locked on the entity, daring it to defy me. And then, slowly, the darkness began to recede, the shadows pulling back, the whispers fading into silence. The entity wavered, its form dissolving, unraveling like smoke, and the room around me began to collapse, the walls crumbling, the floor buckling, as if the very foundations of Silent Creek were unraveling. I turned, sprinting up the staircase, the ground shaking beneath me, the gas station collapsing into itself as I burst through the front door and out into the open air. The figures outside were gone, the twisted faces and hollow eyes vanishing into the dawn as the building crumbled behind me, swallowed by the earth itself. I stumbled to my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys, and as the engine roared to life, I took one last look at the ruins of Silent Creek gas station, watching as it was consumed by the ground, disappearing as though it had never been there at all. I drove away, the sun rising behind me, casting